Let's play a quick game. I'm going to describe a market to you, and you tell me what should happen to prices. In this market, supply has been falling behind demand for the better part of 20 years. Not falling behind by a little, by an estimated several million units, depending on whose model you trust. The low estimate is around 1.5 million. The high estimate is closer to 7 million. And economists at places like Freddie Mac and Zillow argue about the exact number the way sports fans argue about who's the greatest of all time. Meanwhile, demand for this thing hasn't dropped even once during that whole stretch, because the thing in question is shelter. And it turns out humans keep insisting on having a place to sleep. So, supply down, demand steady. What happens to price? If you said price goes up, congratulations. You understand markets better than most of the headlines you're about to read. Because somehow, every few months, a new article comes out explaining that rent is cooling, that the crisis is easing, that things are looking up, and somehow your actual rent renewal notice never seems to have gotten the memo. This is the wealth records. And today, we're going to explain why rent in this country stopped feeling temporary, why the number on your lease renewal keeps climbing even in months when the news tells you rent is cooling, and why, structurally, there is no version of the next decade where it snaps back to what your parents paid. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we do this every week. Take one number everybody's mad about and actually show you the mechanism behind it. And before we get into it, here's what we're building in the comments today. Drop your city and what percentage of your paycheck goes to rent right now. Not a guess. Pull up your bank statement if you have to. We're going to have, by the end of this video, an actual crowdsourced map of who's getting squeezed hardest and where. Last time we did this with grocery prices, we got over 4,000 replies. Let's beat that. Okay, let's get into the math nobody walked you through. Here's the official version of the rent story, the one you'll hear from certain corners of the news. Rent growth is slowing down. Some reports even say national median rent has dipped slightly from its peak. Technically true. And if you're a renter reading that headline, you are probably furious because it does not match your lease renewal notice, which arrived last month with a number that was not, in fact, lower. Both things are true at once. That's the whole trick of this story. Rent growth cooling from a sprint to a jog is not the same as rent becoming affordable. It's the difference between a car slowing from 90 miles an hour to 60. You're still going 60. You have simply stopped accelerating into the wall. Think of this whole video like a bathtub. There's water coming in. That's new renters, new households, people who need a place to live. There's a drain. That's new housing getting built. For the drain to keep the water level flat, it has to keep pace with the faucet. For 20 years, in most of this country, it hasn't. The water's been rising the entire time, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but rising. We're going to come back to this bathtub a few more times, because almost every reason on this list is really just a different way water got into the tub faster than it could drain out. Reason one, we simply didn't build enough homes, and we've known it for years. This isn't a fringe claim. It shows up in reports from Freddie Mac, from Zillow, from housing economists across the political spectrum, and the estimates all land in the same rough neighborhood. The U.S. is short several million homes relative to what the population actually needs. The lowest serious estimates put the gap at around 1.5 million units. The higher estimates run past 5 million, even towards 7 or 8 million by some calculations. Nobody agrees on the exact figure, and honestly, the disagreement itself tells you something. When the estimates all miss each other by millions of units, that's not a rounding error. That's an entire market's worth of housing that should exist and doesn't. Where did that gap come from? Mostly the 2008 financial crisis. Construction cratered when the housing bubble burst, builders went out of business or scaled down hard, and lending for new residential construction dried up. That part makes sense. That's what a crash does. What doesn't make as much sense is what happened next. Construction never really caught back up. Builders who got burned once got cautious for a long time. Permitting slowed. Skilled labor left the industry during the crash, and a lot of it never came back. By the time the market wanted to build again, the pace of new construction, going by permits issued per capita, had settled in well below where it sat in the decades before the crisis. And it mostly stayed there. Translated into your actual life, when there aren't enough homes in a metro area, landlords don't need to compete for you. You need to compete for the apartment. That flips the entire negotiating table. You've felt this if you've ever shown up to view a unit and there were 4 other people also filling out applications on the spot, or if you've ever had a landlord raise the rent on renewal with zero justification beyond the market can bear it. Because when supply is this tight, the market genuinely can bear it. That's not landlords getting greedier as people. That's landlords responding rationally to a shortage that policy created and never fixed. Reason 2, zoning laws are quietly doing more to your rent than any landlord ever will. Here's a fact that annoys almost everyone once they learn it. In a huge share of major American metro areas, it is currently illegal to build anything other than a single detached house on most residential land. Not expensive to build. Illegal. Height restrictions cap the majority of residential land in the country's largest metro areas at about 2 or 3 stories, full stop, regardless of how much housing that area actually needs, how close it is to a train line, or how many people are desperate to live there. Think about what that actually means in practice. A developer looks at a plot of land 2 blocks from a train station in a city with a documented housing shortage. There is obvious, overwhelming demand to put an apartment building there. And in most of that city, they legally cannot. The only thing they're allowed to build is one house, for one family, on a lot that could easily have held 20 apartments. That's not the market failing to provide housing. That's the market being told, by law, that it isn't allowed to. This didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen recently. Most of this zoning code was written decades ago, plenty of it in the 1960s and 70s, by city councils responding to the priorities of that specific moment, and then it was basically never revisited. Nobody woke up in the current housing crisis and decided to write these restrictions. They were already sitting there, quietly, for 50 years, waiting for a population boom and a construction slowdown to turn a mild inefficiency into an actual crisis. So even when there's obvious demand for more apartments near jobs and transit, the drain in our bathtub is welded half shut by decades-old code that most renters have never read a word of. This is the least talked about mechanism in this entire video, and it's arguably the biggest one, because unlike interest rates or investor behavior, it isn't set by some faceless global market. It's set by your own local government, in a meeting most people didn't attend, about a rule most people don't know exists, and in the vast majority of cities, it has been left completely untouched. Reason 3. And this is the one that gets the most attention online, so let's actually check it against the numbers. Big investors buying up all the houses. You've seen this claim probably 100 times. Wall Street is buying every starter home. Private equity owns your entire neighborhood. There's a version of this claim floating around that puts institutional ownership at something like 1 in 5 single-family homes nationally. Here's the actual data, and it's genuinely more complicated than the headline in a way that cuts against the popular narrative. Nationally, large institutional investors, generally defined as entities owning 1,000+ homes, own somewhere around 3% of single-family rental homes. 3%. Multiple independent sources, including the Urban Institute, Brookings-affiliated researchers, and Bank of America's own analysts, land on roughly that same low single-digit figure. The overwhelming majority of single-family rentals in this country, somewhere around 80% by some estimates, are owned by small, local landlords, often with fewer than 10 properties total. Not hedge funds. Your neighbor with a duplex he inherited from his dad. Now, that 3% is not evenly spread, and this is the part worth sitting with instead of just dismissing the whole idea. In a specific cluster of southeastern metro areas, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Charlotte, Tampa, institutional ownership climbs into the high teens or low 20s. And in those particular cities, it genuinely does distort the local market in a way that's measurable. This got politically loud enough that in January of this year, an executive order was signed specifically to restrict large institutional buyers from purchasing single-family homes going forward. So evidently, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle think it matters enough somewhere to act on it. Worth noting too, even before that order, a lot of these big investors had already started pulling back and becoming net sellers, not buyers, as the math on those portfolios stopped working as well as it used to. So the honest version of reason 3 is real but narrow. It's a genuine problem in a handful of specific cities. It is not the explanation for what happened to your rent in most of the country. Treating a hedge fund bought your neighborhood as the national story is by the actual data, mostly a scapegoat, a satisfying villain that lets everyone skip past the much larger, much more boring truth, which is reasons 1 and 2. A supply gap and a zoning code that have been quietly compounding since before most renters watching this were even born. Reason 4, wages did not remotely keep up, and this is where the pain actually lives. Here's a stat that should honestly get more airtime than it does. Rent has been growing several times faster than income for years running, by some measures well over 5 times the pace when you look at the stretch since 2000. Not slightly faster, multiples faster. That's not a cost of living went up a bit story. That's an entire category of household expense detaching itself from the paycheck that's supposed to cover it. And even in the recent period where headlines are calling rent growth slower, renters' actual housing costs have still climbed roughly 40% since before the pandemic, while typical incomes moved up nowhere near that fast. That gap, rent sprinting, paychecks jogging, is the actual lived experience underneath every other reason on this list. You can survive a housing shortage just fine if your raises track it. Most people's raises do not track it, and that's the entire difference between housing costs went up as a mild inconvenience and housing costs went up as the reason you're checking your bank balance before buying groceries. Here's where this connects back to reasons 1 and 2, and it's the single most important stat in this whole video. Even in the recent stretch where national rent growth has slowed to something close to flat, even with headlines telling renters things are getting better, the share of renters who are cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on rent, sits at a record high. Roughly half of all renter households in this country are now cost-burdened. Half. And among renters who spend more than half their income on rent, the severely burdened category, that number has also been climbing for years and shows no sign of reversing. That's not a bad year. That's the new floor. Sit with that for a second, because it's the whole thesis of this video in one fact. Rent cooling and renters getting crushed are not contradictory. They're the same graph, viewed from two different angles. The water stopped rising quite as fast. It never stopped being over your head. Reason 5, even the people trying to fix this are fighting each other, not just the problem. This is the reason that rarely makes it into a tidy headline, because it doesn't have a clean villain, but it might be the most honest one on the list. Cities that loosen zoning to allow more apartments often get overruled or slowed down by state-level rules that don't. Renters who desperately want more construction near them run directly into existing homeowners who, reasonably from their own self-interest, often oppose new density in their neighborhood, because it can affect property values, parking, or the character of a block they've lived on for decades. That's not a cartoonish villain. That's just two groups of ordinary people with directly conflicting interests. And in most local governments, the people who already own homes and show up to city council meetings have vastly more influence than the renters who don't. Layer onto that federal housing policy that shifts meaningfully from one administration to the next, one term focused on restricting institutional buyers, the next focused on something else entirely, incentive programs that get created and then quietly left to expire, tax credits that get proposed and then stall in Congress for years. There is no single villain signing your rent increase. There's a slow, uncoordinated, multi-decade failure spread across thousands of local governments and several federal administrations to keep the drain open while the faucet kept running. It's less a conspiracy than an inheritance. Nobody currently in office built this, and almost everybody currently in office is inheriting it. So let's go back to the bathtub one last time, because every single reason on this list is really the same mechanism wearing a different hat. The faucet, population growth, new households, basic demand for shelter, never stopped running, and it never will, because people don't stop needing homes no matter what the interest rate is or who's in the White House. The drain, construction, especially the kind zoning currently forbids across huge swaths of this country, has been narrower than it needed to be for the better part of 2 decades, and nobody with the power to widen it has done so at the scale the problem actually requires. Slower rent growth in a given quarter doesn't widen the drain. It just means the tub is filling up less violently than it was last year. It is still filling up. That's why rent is cooling and half of renters are cost-burdened at record levels can both be true in the same news cycle without contradicting each other. They're not describing two different situations. They're describing the same bathtub at 2 different speeds. It's not magic, and it's not a conspiracy either, despite how satisfying the investor story is. It's just math nobody walked you through. The math of underbuilding, the math of zoning maps drawn up before most of us were alive, and the math of wages that never got the memo. Drop your city and your rent-to-income percentage below. Let's see this map fill in. And if you've got a friend who's convinced their rent went up because a hedge fund is personally out to get them, send them this video before they buy the wrong villain. Hit subscribe. The wealth records. The pattern is always there if you know where to look. I do.